Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Great Minds in Philosophy series. As requested by popular vote that was a few months ago at this point, we are going to be doing the next of our major great mind in philosophy, this being Immanuel Kant. And this video is going to be an introduction to the topic on Immanuel Kant. We will just talk a little bit about some of the interesting elements of Kantian philosophy, also some of the difficulties in the reading and the interpretation of Kantian philosophy. I slightly resent, to an extent, some of the people who voted for Kant in the previous poll on the Great Minds series, given the fact that that means that I've had to read Immanuel Kant in his original text, which is just particularly difficult for anybody, including a philosophy graduate. But there we go. Fair enough. This is going to be a series of lessons on the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. We'll outline the scope of this series in the end of this video, talk about the kinds of things that we're going to be examining. Of course, because this is going to be about a 10 or 11 episode series, we are not going to be able to discuss Immanuel Kant in the most greatest of detail. The aim is to provide a nice overview of the kinds of ideas that Immanuel Kant contributed to not just ethics or moral philosophy, as most people understand, but also the ideas relating to epistemology, to the philosophy of art, to ideas within political philosophy and metaphysics, all of which contribute to Kantian philosophy being one of the most important for anybody to understand. So this is the second in our series in the Great Minds of Philosophy. The first was the philosophy of John Rawls. We've completed John Rawls and Rawlsian philosophy now, and we are now moving on to Immanuel Kant, arguably one of the most influential philosophers in human history. Now, as I've mentioned at the start, despite being one of the most influential philosophers in human history, he is also simultaneously one of the most difficult to understand philosophers in human history, which essentially gives rise to a problem when it comes to Kantian philosophy, which is that reading Kant in his original text, or just reading primary sources, should I say, primary Kantian philosophy, is often difficult. Now, I'm not reading in the original text because I don't speak German, but I'm reading the original sources. So, a Critique of Pure Reason, for example, and on the Metaphysics of Morals, for example, all of which I've had to go through and understand in great detail. In this lesson specifically, what we shall do is introduce some of Kant's most important theories, and we will define the scope of this series of lessons for the future. So, Kant, as we know, and as you voted, presumably on the basis of, was an incredibly important philosopher who arguably contributed to a vast array of different philosophical traditions. It is difficult to understand Kant without trying to understand him as an interdisciplinary philosopher. Some philosophers are generally quite limited, or quite they keep themselves to themselves in terms of the area of philosophy that they spend a lot of time in, especially academic philosophers to this day. Academic philosophers to this day are not necessarily philosophers. They will be academic ethicists or academic metaphysicians or political philosophers, and they tend to stay broadly within that tradition, and when they dip into other areas, it's more as a sort of intellectual curiosity rather than actually contributing necessarily to the broader corpus of academic literature. Similarly, too, John Rawls was fundamentally a political philosopher. He wrote a little bit about ethics. He wrote quite a lot of critique of utilitarianism, but in that regard, he was a political philosopher, and so he wrote those elements of ethics and moral philosophy with the view of using that as a way of critiquing moral philosophy and critiquing it from the political perspective. And arguably, people within philosophy argue that political philosophy is just a type of applied ethics anyway. So Rawls was a quite limited in terms of the areas of philosophy that he dipped his toes into fundamentally. Kant is different because Kant fundamentally transgressed across a number of different philosophical traditions. Okay, on the one hand, he is known extensively for his contributions to metaphysics and to epistemology. Famously, the work Critique of Pure Reason being a very important element of theories of epistemology and metaphysics. famously grounding his theories of transcendental idealism as being fundamental. So that's on the one hand. But then on the other hand, he is known for his contributions to moral philosophy, developing his ideas of Kantian ethics, establishing a concept of deontology, his categorical imperative, and the postulates of practical reason, all of which are moral and ethical issues. So you could really theoretically do a series of videos on just Kantian ethics, and then do a series of videos on Kantian metaphysics and Kantian epistemology. We're not going to do that for this series. We're going to try and keep the different traditions in a nice broad overview as much as we possibly can. In terms of his lesser known contributions to philosophy, we can make reference to his contributions to political philosophy. Now, arguably, as I've mentioned, political philosophy is arguably just a branch of applied ethics, and so to that extent and in that vein, you could apply Kantian philosophy you can apply Kantian ethics, should I say, to political philosophy and to making political decisions. Equally, Kant is very highly regarded when we look at the philosophy of global justice and international relations and international law. But again, we'll only touch on these very briefly. Kant would also contribute to the philosophy, an area of philosophy known as aesthetics, which is the idea of the theory of art and beauty, the idea of how things look, essentially. So with all that being said, Kant is a very important philosopher, and by the end of this series of lessons, you're going to have a very good overview, a very detailed overview of the various different areas of philosophy that Kant contributed to, and some of the theories that he developed therein. So, like I said, we're making a contribution of an overview of one of the great contributors to philosophy. For this reason, we'll be spending a lot of our time looking at Kantian approaches to metaphysics and epistemology, as well as to moral philosophy. Those are the sort of three big areas where Kant spent a lot of his time writing. And so for that reason, we will spend the majority of our time talking about those particular issues. But then we will finally spend some time looking at more of the subsidiary contributions that he approaches with the topic of things like aesthetics and political philosophy. So this is the series of lessons. This is the scope of the series of lessons going forward. We'll start by just doing a very brief overview of the life of Immanuel Kant, his influences, where he's from, the kinds of things that he did, and the kind of approaches that he actually went for when it came to philosophical reasoning. We will then get on to Kantian metaphysics and epistemology, beginning first with the epistemic side of this debate, talking about things relating to knowledge and the acquisition of knowledge and the types of knowledge that can exist. We will then talk about, in quite great detail, his theory of transcendental idealism, one of the most important theories that he approaches when it comes to metaphysics and epistemology. And then finally, looking at the parts 4 and part 5 of metaphysics and epistemology will involve a conversation about transcendent metaphysics, as well as a theory of experience, both again being approaches within Kantian ethics that are important to explore. We will then get on to looking at Kantian ethics. Immanuel Kant is arguably most well known for either his metaphysics and his epistemology, or for his ethics and his approaches to ethics. We will talk about the ideas of duty and deontology, and then we will talk about the categorical imperative, before finishing on a couple of the more, like I said, subsidiary issues within Kantian theory, which is of course Kant's political philosophy and Kant's theory of art.